Hello, listeners, and welcome to the revised edition of Chrontendo Episode 2. This is a completely new, re-recorded version of the old Episode 2, which, like all the early Chrontendo episodes, had some pretty terrible sound. This new edition hopes to fix the sound problems and bring the episode more in line with later episodes. We left off in June 1984, about 1 year into the life of the Famicom. Up to this point, every single Famicom release was published by Nintendo themselves. But by this point, the Famicom was very successful in Japan. Nintendo was trying to get the Famicom over to the US, and other companies were getting interested in a piece of the action. So in the second half of 1984, the first two third-party publishers join in. Hudson Soft, a Japanese developer of computer software, and Namco, the arcade giant. Obviously, Nintendo can't produce dozens of games a year themselves, so third-party interest is going to be the key to the success of the Famicom. Let's begin in July 1984. We open up July 1984 with Donkey Kong 3. Let's take a quick look at the title screen. It looks just like all the other games we saw last episode. Black background, game logo, a few play options. If you let it sit for a moment, you'll get this demo screen. Now, Donkey Kong 3 is obviously the sequel to Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., first released in arcades in 1983. Now, the game completely alters the formula, and instead of being a platformer, it's more like an old-school shoot-'em-up. It's often stated that an earlier Nintendo game, a Galaxian ripoff called Space Firebird, is sort of the inspiration for Donkey Kong 3, and there are some similarities, including the shrapnel spraying bomb. So anyway, Donkey Kong 3 has a bit more going on than most early shooters. There's a power-up, for example, like that bottle of super bug spray that Donkey Kong will drop. This will kill enemies in one shot and will push up Donkey Kong much faster. And the game also differs from most shooters in that killing the bugs is not your main concern. You are simply trying to stop the bugs from killing you as you attack Donkey Kong himself. Your actual goal is to get Donkey Kong to the top of the screen. Now, should he happen to reach the bottom of the ropes he's hanging from, he'll drop down, killing you instantly. You also need to protect your flowers from being carried away by the bugs. Well, the plot here is that Stanley, yeah, that's his name, has some sort of flying insect infestation in his greenhouse, and Donkey Kong just coincidentally is hanging out there as well. Now, why wasn't Mario featured? Was Nintendo going to spin off Stanley into his own game series like they were doing with Mario? Well, it didn't work simply because this game was not as successful as the first two. Now, there's only 3 levels that repeat infinitely and gradually get more difficult. Much like Popeye, the home version looks decent but doesn't quite capture everything in the arcade game, such as the large swarms of flying bugs hanging around the beehives, those are missing here, or the flowers booming between levels. Donkey Kong 3 is the first example of a strange Nintendo sequel syndrome. Sequels that are very different from their predecessors. Super Mario Bros. 2 and The Adventures of Link being other examples. As the black sheep of the Donkey Kong games, this seems to have soured Nintendo on the character. No more Kong games were released for the next 10 years until 1994 when a Game Boy Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Country came out, reviving the franchise. At last, we have the first Famicom game from a third-party publisher, Nuts and Milk by Hudson Soft, a name we'll encounter many times throughout Chrontendo. Now, there are 2 sources that games can be ported from: arcade titles like those from Nintendo, and computer games such as this. Hudson Soft didn't make arcade games, they released games for Japanese computers such as the MSX and NEC's PC 6600 and 8800, among others. There were several popular computers on the Japanese market in the early 80s. Hudson seems to have had some kind of like special connection with Nintendo. Not only were they the first outside company to make Famicom games, they also released versions of Nintendo games on Japanese computers, such as Punchball Mario Bros. These games have actually been reworked quite a bit from the Nintendo originals. Nuts and Milk first came out on a few different computer systems in early 1984, one of the many games Hudson was putting out for computers at that time, though the game is actually copyrighted in 1983. However, the original is very different from the Famicom game. It's much simpler graphically and even resembles like Pac-Man a bit. The object is simply to collect all the fruit and then reach the heart to exit the level. Now for the Famicom Nuts and Milk, Hudson completely redesigned it, making it much more Nintendo-esque, with cuter characters and completely new levels. Basically, they made it into a platform game. The title screen is even in the standard Nintendo format. There's also a Mario Brothers-like bonus level. And even the chains that you climb on look kinda like those in Donkey Kong Jr. Now there is one unusual feature here, it's the edit mode, something seen occasionally on these old Famicom games. You're allowed to fool around with the levels, redesign them. You can also try playing your custom levels, though this one ended up not turning out so well. Just like the computer version, the object is to collect all the fruit while avoiding the enemies. This will open up the house at the top. Then you just need to reach the house, go to your girlfriend, and it'll move you on to the next level. 50 levels in all. And at the end of those, you get the classic congratulations screen, and it starts all over again. So Nuts and Milk is a reasonably fun, if very simple game. We'd see a lot of early Famicom games in this format, lots of short levels, as was common at the time. Though it's interesting that it offered a total of 50 levels, whereas most Nintendo-developed games, such as Donkey Kong, Popeye, had 3 or 4. This is possible because basically each level uses a finite number of elements, bricks, chains, etc., which are then rearranged to make new levels. So anyway, Nuts and Milk is hardly the greatest example of this particular genre, but it's an important game in the history of the Famicom. Very shortly after Nuts and Milk, Hudson Soft released their second Famicom game, Lode Runner. There's a nice original musical theme here. We've seen more than one Famicom game with virtually no music, so this is sort of a sign that Hudson's taking the Famicom pretty seriously. Remember that wall-to-wall music during video games wasn't really a given at the time. Now, this is a game you yourself may have played, since unlike Nuts and Milk, it was released in the US eventually. Though not by Hudson themselves, Lode Runner actually has a pretty long and twisty release history. Back in 1984, it was still a hot new computer game created by one guy, Doug Smith, and first released on the Apple II in 1983, published by Broderbund. It was a huge hit, and was ported to every system known to mankind. Now, in terms of Japan, it reached arcades in 1984, courtesy of Irem. Note that the featureless stick figures have been replaced with cavemen and a guy in like a futuristic-looking outfit. Irem would release several Lode Runner arcade games. Now, surprisingly, Hudson themselves were not responsible for the Japanese computer releases. Nope, System Soft, another Japanese software company, put out a number of versions, and Sony released this MSX version, which looks just like the original Apple computer game. So Hudson redesigned the entire look of the game themselves, though it uses some levels from the original. The simple stick figures were filled out. The protagonist looks pretty similar to the guy in Irem's game. He's wearing a space helmet that looks just like the other guys. But the bad guys, well, if they look familiar, that's because Hudson reused that exact same sprite for Bomberman. In fact, in the ending of the Japanese version of Bomberman, they tried to link the two games together by claiming Bomberman became the character in Lode Runner. So for those not familiar with Lode Runner, here's how it works. You run around collecting piles of gold, evading your pursuers. Your one weapon is the ability to dig a hole, which will temporarily trap one bad guy, or allow you to drop down through it to the level below. Once you've collected all the piles of gold, a ladder appears and you can escape the level. The levels then get harder, and then even harder. Upon release, the Hudson Lode Runner became a huge hit in Japan, selling over 1 million copies, and still remains, I believe, one of Hudson's best-selling games ever. Once the NES came out in the US, Broderbund themselves released Hudson's versions, though not until 1987. So here we have the beginning of a common occurrence, the US getting NES games sometimes a few years after the Japanese release. Another common occurrence, the Broderbund cover art depicts the game completely differently than Hudson's art. It's painted in what I call the young adult novel cover style of illustration, and makes Lode Runner himself look like an Indiana Jones kind of guy, whereas Hudson's box art is much more cartoony looking and features a super deformed protagonist. But probably the most notable of all the changes Hudson made was that the levels now take up multiple screens, thus the screen scrolls as you move, Now, Hogan's Alley used some basic horizontal scrolling, but Lode Runner is really the first game in which for the Famicom, in which you control the scrolling by moving your on-screen avatar. As you get about 1/4 of the screen length from the edge, your character suddenly stays still and the background begins moving. Side-scrolling is the foundation upon which many Famicom games are based, and Lode Runner was the first Famicom game to actually utilize it. There were no Famicom games released in August, but there was one in September, Galaxian, the first Famicom title from Namco, or rather Namcot. Why does it say Namcot? Well, that was what Namco decided to call its home division, so all the Famicom games we see will show Namcot on the title screen. What does that name mean? Apparently no one at Namco can remember why they chose that name. Possibly it's a severely shortened Namco Home Entertainment. Now, I assume that most of you have heard of Galaxian. This was the game that sort of put Namco on the map when it was released back in 1979. It's essentially a souped-up clone of Space Invaders, only the aliens' behavior is a bit more complex. They'll fly down little squadrons and attack you. Also, Galaxian was the first arcade game to use multicolored sprites, so it was very impressive when it first hit arcades. Namco, short for Nakamura Entertainment, had been in the amusement business since the mid-1950s. In the middle of the 1970s, they began to switch from mechanical arcade games to video games, and they became about the biggest arcade manufacturer in existence after the enormous success of Pac-Man. Well, I guess the Famicom Galaxian looks pretty good. The graphics of the original were pretty simple. Everything in the arcade game is here, yet the home version feels a little different somehow. It seems easier for your shots to pass between the rows of aliens. It just sort of plays a little bit differently, though it's very subtle. Other than that, there's really not much to say beyond what you're seeing in these videos. Now, you may have observed that Galaxian was never released in the United States. One rather odd fact, the US arm of Namco didn't have any sort of home entertainment division back in the 1980s. So despite their games being huge, Namco didn't publish any console games in the US until 1990. Now, I believe much of this had to do with Namco's general dislike of Nintendo, and in particular Nintendo of America's policies, so many Famicom Namco games didn't get US releases, or they were published by other companies. Alright, of all the games in Chrontendo Episode 2, this is probably the most interesting for a couple of reasons. Devil World, in which you play as a small dragon named Tamagon, who is going to quote-unquote attack the Devil World. That is, he is presumably traveling to Hell in order to take on the devil face to face, because I guess that's what dragons do. So this is a Pac-Man style maze game, but a rather odd one. The object is to clear the screen of all the little dots, but there's a catch. You can only collect the dots if you're holding a cross. You need to pass over one of the crosses found in various parts of the maze, and then you can start picking up the dots, until the cross disappears after around 10 seconds or so. You will then need to grab another cross. Thankfully, the crosses aren't like Pac-Man's power pellets. They don't disappear when you pick one up. You can collect as many crosses as you need from the same location. Also, the crosses have another use. You can breathe fire while holding one. This turns enemies into what appear to be a fried egg, or maybe a fried eyeball, which you then eat. Yeah, I said the game was kind of odd. Furthermore, the devil himself is causing you headaches while all this is going on. That's him up there at the top, dressed in fancy white gloves and some sort of red bikini underwear, constantly disco dancing while you run around the maze. Well, really, he's pointing in the direction that his minions will start turning the cranks and move the maze around. So not only do you need to deal with monsters in the maze, but also the maze walls are moving around which can trap and crush you. The second maze replaces the crosses and dots with 4 Bibles, which you need to collect and place in some sort of weird altar thing in the middle. Doing this will cause the devil to get all pissed and then turn into a bat and fly away. You then play a bonus level, or bonus box, as the game calls it. Then the same 2 levels repeat over and over again. So aside from its generally insane quality, Devil World is known as one of the few Shigeru Miyamoto games that never got a US release. It's incidentally the first game to team up Miyamoto with Takeshi Tezuka. The two would later go on to design such games as Super Mario Bros. And Legend of Zelda. Devil World also has music by Koji Kondo, so the Super Mario Dream Team is virtually in place in this game. Also, this is one of the rare Nintendo games which didn't meet Nintendo of America's standards due to religious content. All the devils, Bibles, and crosses obviously violated the rules which prohibited religious symbols in NES games. Many Japanese titles would not get a US release, but normally this is because Nintendo felt they would not appeal to American kids. Eventually, Devil World got a European release. Well, it's hardly a classic on the level of something like Super Mario Bros., but still it's a pretty high watermark for early Famicom original games. November is here, and first off we have F1 Race from Nintendo. This is, as you might have gathered, a racing game, the first racing game on this platform. Oddly, this was never given a US release. Unlike Devil World, there is nothing that could be considered offensive. I'm thinking that since Nintendo was releasing a later game, Mach Rider, as a launch title, they decided they didn't really want 2 very similar games for the system at the same time, so F1 Race just got passed by. This style of 3D racing game was still pretty new when F1 Race came out. The genre was defined by Namco's Pole Position from 1982. F1 is really just a thinly disguised Pole Position clone. We've got the same behind-the-vehicle viewpoint, the same cars, the mountains in the background, and the billboards going by. F1 does move the camera up to a slightly higher angle, however. Now granted, for a very early Famicom game, and the first that attempts any sort of 3D effects, F1 does look pretty good. Not nearly as good as later titles like Rad Racer, but still it's pretty impressive. Those billboards, however, never get any bigger, they just stay in the background. Maybe they're really huge billboards that are miles away. Now just like Pole Position, F1 is one of those racing games where if your bumper barely taps another car's tire, you'll suddenly burst into a huge fireball, while the other car remains unharmed, I might add. The controls pretty much do what they should. Everything is relatively simple. You just have 2 gears and an accelerator. It's a decent little game, and certainly the most visually impressive racing game released on a console at this point. Too bad it never came out in the US. It's Namco again, and this time they bring us Pac-Man, their massive arcade hit from 1980. In fact, the most successful arcade game of all time. Pac-Man was a genuine pop culture phenomenon. You saw Pac-Man on everything. There were lines to play Pac-Man games in arcades. There was even a top 10 hit song about Pac-Man. Does Halo have its own hit song? No. The original game was designed by Toru Iwatani and was originally called Pac-Man in Japan. Though confusingly, it was supposedly inspired by the term paku paku, which refers to the sound of mouth flapping open and closed. So why do they call it Pac-Man when Pac-Man is closer to Paku? I don't know. Well, as we see here, the Famicom game is quite close to the arcade game, shockingly so as a matter of fact. For such a popular game, it had a pretty checkered history of ports. Let's take a look. The first and most despised is of course the Atari 2600 release from 1981. Nowadays everyone hates this, but back then people knew that a 2600 game wasn't going to look like the arcade game. It was the biggest selling console game at the time, 7 million copies. That's more than Sonic the Hedgehog, Legend of Zelda, or Gears of War, so it wasn't exactly a flop. Still, better versions came out pretty quickly, often by Atari themselves. The Atari 8-bit computer version has more rounded edges and a maze that is roughly equivalent to that in the arcades. Intellivision's 1983 version changes the layout of the maze a bit, but it has brighter colors, nice blues and yellows. And if you can stomach that horrible sounding musical theme, the Apple II version has a very accurate maze layout, but terrible colors, and not much in terms of sound effects. And then suddenly this. The sound is not perfect, but it feels a lot like the real Pac-Man. To an observer in 1984, this would be pretty amazing. The fact that you could finally, after 4 years, play a reasonable facsimile of Pac-Man right down to the intro screen. Unlike many earlier versions, Namco kept the arcade proportions of the maze and added a score and whatnot to the right-hand side, as opposed to stretching the maze out to fill the screen horizontally. The maze is actually a little squished horizontally. The 4 islands across the top are all the same size here. In the arcade version, the middle 2 are a little bit longer. And the controls aren't quite right. A few times I had difficulty making a turn, sort of like in the 2600 version, but with some practice I'm sure this could be overcome. Now, unlike Galaxian, this did get a US release by Namco in 1993. That's gotta be about the longest gap between a Japanese and US release of a particular game. By that time, Pac-Man was 13 years old and officially a retro game. And there was also a Tengen version, but that's a story for another day. Hey, that's a rather suggestive looking character on the title screen. No, don't worry, this is not one of those kind of Mahjong games. It's just a plain old boring Mahjong game from Hudson Soft. Specifically, it's for Nin Uchi Mahjong. And the odd thing is, while this was developed by Hudson, it was actually published by Nintendo themselves. Unlike Nintendo's earlier Mahjong game, this has you facing off against a total of 3 other opponents. So it more resembles the real-life game of Mahjong. Just like all the other early Hudson Famicom games, it's based on a computer title. In this case, it was originally an MSX game called Jiankyo from earlier in 1984. Hudson has a whole series of card games or gambling games for the MSX, and this was the Mahjong entry in that series. The name was completely changed for the Famicom version, so I assume Hudson wasn't trying to sell this as a port of a computer game. Well, anyway, it's just another Mahjong game, and this is not going to be interesting to anyone who doesn't play Mahjong, which I assume is 99.99% of those listening right now. One little thing, hitting the select button shows the other player's hands. This seems sort of like cheating to me, but whatever. Our third Namco game, Xevious, while not the huge arcade hit Pac-Man was still a very popular and influential game. Just like Pac-Man, Namco tries to recreate the arcade title screen, not very successfully in this case. Unlike Hudson, Namco didn't try to copy the Nintendo-style title screen all the time. Also, their box art has its own style. They eschewed the simple cartoon art of Nintendo and Hudson games. If you look at the box art for today's Namco games, you'll notice something. They are sequentially numbered. Xevious, for example, has a large 3 in the left corner, this being their third Famicom game. I'm not sure why this caught on in Japan, but several other publishers did this as well. Maybe they were trying to appeal to the collector mentality. So here's the arcade Xevious, with its much fancier logo. The arcade game obviously had different colors and more detail, but overall the two games look quite a bit alike. The main difference is, unlike Pac-Man, Namco has expanded the game horizontally to fit the Famicom screen dimensions. Now, Xevious is the first shoot-'em-up for the Famicom. While Xevious, the arcade game, was not the first scrolling shoot-'em-up, it was the first to make a big impression. Xevious is one of those handful of games that pretty much defined a genre. Every vertical shoot-'em-up after this was based more or less on the Xevious formula. So you fly forward and shoot enemy ships before they shoot you. Really the same basic idea as Space Invaders or Galaxian, only now you have the ability to move in any direction, and enemies are constantly coming at you and will actually fly right past you if you don't shoot them down. You Ever wonder why the enemy crafts in these that you don't kill don't simply turn around and shoot you from behind? And where are all these guys headed to anyway? Apparently shooting you isn't their main priority. Also, Xevious threw in a nice detailed scrolling background to make it look like you were like flying over the surface of some planet. And I think this is part of the appeal. Unlike Galaxian, it looked like you were actually going somewhere. Maybe eventually you would reach your destination. It gave gamers more motivation to keep playing because they sort of want to see what was ahead. In this case, there never really was any destination. If you made it to the end of the background, it simply started over from the beginning. Unlike later shoot-'em-ups, there's really no end to the story of Xevious. You just sort of fly around in a circle forever and ever. You have two weapons in Xevious, a laser for shooting down aircraft and a bomb for destroying surface enemies. The crosshairs are for targeting your bombs. Every so often, like, these boss things will appear. These are large armed bases on the ground, though destroying them doesn't really get you anything other than points. One unusual feature of Xevious was the adjustable difficulty. If you play more aggressively, shooting down lots of enemies, the game will throw tougher enemies at you. You can simply avoid most enemies if you wish, since they'll fly off screen if you don't shoot them. Now, Xevious was designed by someone named Masanobu Endo, who would in early days of video games probably be the most well-known game designer in Japan. Not only did he design several popular games, but he went public, appearing on TV shows and in commercials, which was unheard of in Japan at the time. We'll see more of his games later in Chrontendo. Xevious did eventually get a US release by PacMan in 1988. However, in Japan, it was one of Namco's most successful titles ever, selling over 1 million copies. November 14th has two game releases, Urban Champion and Mappy. We'll start with Urban Champion. Unlike the last couple Nintendo games, this was released in the United States. Of course, it still wasn't very good and seems to have been almost completely forgotten today. Urban Champion is a very early fighting game, perhaps the second true fighting game released, Karate Champ being the first. There were a few sort of proto-fighting games that came out earlier, and this is pretty simple. The object is basically to hit the other guy. Now, despite the fact that Urban Champion is not held in very high esteem nowadays, it did pioneer some fighting game techniques. How it works is this. Pressing up or down on the D-pad will place your hands in the higher or lower positions. Hitting a button will throw a punch, either high or low, depending on where your hands are. Also, having your hands in the right position will block the opponent's punch. There are two punches, a fast, weak punch, and a slower, more powerful one. A powerful punch will actually knock your opponent down for a moment. While Karate Champ also had blocking, Urban Champion was, as Hardcore Gaming 101 puts it, the first fighting game to have easily controllable, reliable blocking. You can also dodge a punch by pressing back on the D-pad. The object here is to push your opponent off the screen until he lands in a manhole. Then you'll win the round, and a random stranger will throw confetti on you. You only have about a minute to bask in the confetti-strewn glory, since the fight will begin a few seconds later. And so it goes, and there's only one opponent in Urban Champion. You may notice the game takes place in front of such tough guy hangouts as the library and the discount store. Now there are some other aspects, however. Every so often a cop will roll by, and the fight will break up for a moment. When you move from screen to screen, your stamina and time will be reset. Stamina and time are not really that important, but if your stamina reaches 0, you'll be unable to fight for a moment, and if the time runs out, the cops will come and arrest the opponent with the lowest stamina. Why they only arrest the guy who's losing the fight, I don't know. So Urban Champion is sort of dull and repetitive and doesn't have many fancy features of modern day fighters like multiple characters, but it definitely has its place in the history of the fighting genre. The fourth and final Namco game in this episode is Mappy, a port of the 1983 arcade game, which I remember quite well. Seems like you saw the arcade game quite a bit in the mid-80s, but apparently it was more successful in Japan. I'm not sure why this never received any domestic ports back then, though the sequel, Mappy Land, did. Now here's the arcade game. It used the same board as Super Pac-Man and Tower of Druaga, a game that'll come to haunt us in the future. Cute little game, upbeat, old-timey music. You control a mouse, Mappy, who's trying to round up a bunch of goods that were stolen by a gang of cats. Alright, now here's the Famicom version. Looks quite similar, the main difference is the screen dimensions. Much more of the level fits on each screen because it's considerably wider. It was actually the second Famicom game to use horizontal scrolling, by the way. Now, Mappy, despite being an officer of the law, isn't chasing the thieves, in fact they're chasing him. He has some sort of baton, but still Mappy can't arrest or even try to subdue the cats. The only weapon he has are those glowing microwave doors. They shoot out a rather menacing electromagnetic wave when opened, and this will temporarily disable any of the cats. It will also push you back as well, so you have to be careful when you open those doors. I'm sure using such weapons on suspects is illegal in most countries. The goal here is to pick up all the stolen goods, TVs, copies of the Mona Lisa, that sort of thing. You get bonus rounds after every few levels. The name Mappy doesn't make much sense in English, but apparently Mappo is a Japanese slang term for a cop. Well, this is a pretty fun little game. If you've never played Mappy, I'd say give it a try. We've almost reached the end of 1984, just 2 more games. From November 22nd is Clu Clu Land. Much like Urban Champion, it's a game that is not so much remembered today. It's sort of a Pac-Man-like idea, only with no maze. Instead, the challenge comes from the sort of weird control scheme. Now, the odd-looking creature that you control is named Bubbles, and is apparently female. Not that you can tell. And the things that chase after you are, I guess, sea urchins. So here's the deal, all those dots, those are pegs that you can grab onto. You do this by hitting the D-pad to extend your claw. You will then revolve around the peg until you let go. This is how you change directions. The object is to find the hidden gold ingots. These are invisible until you pass over them. Once you've found every ingot, you've completed the level. Along the way, of course, you'll need to watch out for the urchins and also those black holes. There's one in the middle there. If you touch the black hole, you get sucked in and die. Of course, why are there black holes at the bottom of the ocean? At least that's where I assume this game takes place. It's rather weird. Now, the urchins, you can fortunately shoot them with this little weapon you have that just like waves at them. This will temporarily stun them. If you then run them down while stunned, they'll die temporarily. Just like the Pac-Man ghosts, they'll come back. The name Clu Clu Land, as you might suspect, is one of those names like Mappy that makes more sense to the Japanese. It's an English version of Kuru Kuru, Kuru being that horrible brain disease spread through cannibalism, so the main subject matter is actually pretty gruesome. Now, an alternate, though less interesting theory is that Kuru Kuru means, like something spinning around in Japanese. It's supposed to be the sound a spinning object makes. Now, the main challenge is the unusual method of controlling your character. You need to hit the D-pad in the direction that corresponds to which claw you want to stick out. If you're moving up or down, this means using the left or right on the D-pad. If you're traveling horizontally, then use up or down. Timing can be tricky, and I've missed a peg many times. Same with releasing from the peg. Doing so at the wrong time can send you headfirst into an urchin or a black hole. The game is really not that long, only 20 levels and a few bonus levels. It was released on the Famicom Disk System a few years down the road with a few gameplay changes. So Clu Clu Land along with Urban Champion are well-made games that really don't try to have what it takes to be considered to be a classic. Whoa, look at that! A blue screen instead of a black one. Nintendo is getting pretty wild. The last game of 1984 is one that, along with Duck Hunt, is one of the best remembered of these early releases, at least in the United States. In Japan, I think baseball and golf were actually the biggest sellers back then. Anyway, Excitebike is a well-designed side-view racing game. Nintendo finally goes all out with wall-to-wall horizontal scrolling, something we'll see a lot more of in the near future. There are 5 tracks. The object is to beat a certain time. If you do so, you'll move on to the next track. If not, it's game over, though from the menu you can choose to play any track you like. And there are 2 acceleration buttons. A is standard acceleration, and is what you'll be using most of the time. B is some sort of turbo. You go faster, but it also heats your engine up, as per the gauge at the bottom of the screen. So use turbo too much and the engine will overheat. Thankfully, you have those little strips with arrows on them that you see along the ground occasionally. You might think those are like the go faster strips, but they actually cool your engines, and you can use left or right on the D-pad to raise or lower the front of your bike, which is helpful when going over hills. So while Excitebike is pretty simple, it's pretty fun. The bike controls pretty well, and the turbo adds a nice little risk and reward factor into the game. There's also a couple other modes. The second regular option puts other racers on the track. This makes things a bit harder because they keep running into and knocking you down. Seriously, it's pretty tough to avoid these guys. Despite the presence of other racers, you're not really racing them. It's still all time-based. It doesn't matter whether they pass you up or not. And finally, there's a popular edit mode. Here you can create your own tracks and then use them. In Japan, players could actually save their tracks on cassette using something called the Famicom data recorder. Battery saves had not yet been invented. This was one of the very few games compatible with the data recorder. Outside of Japan, you were screwed. The save option simply didn't work. So Excitebike is a minor classic in its own way, and definitely a very good way for Nintendo to end this year. Here's a pattern we'll be seeing in Chrontendo. A very busy release schedule at the end of the year, with tons of games coming out in November, and starting in 1985, December as well, then very slim pickings after the holidays. In this case, the New Year's first games hit the shelves on the 4th week of January, with 2 titles by Nintendo. Okay, Nintendo's back to the standard black background here. First game of 1985 is Balloon Fight. One very notable fact, it's the first Famicom game that I'm aware of by longtime Nintendo collaborators HAL Laboratory. The most notable employee of HAL is Satoru Iwata, who worked as programmer on this game and eventually became HAL's president. He then moved to Nintendo and of course is the current president of Nintendo. So, you're this little fellow that flies using a couple of balloons tied to his back. Your goal is to clear the screen of other flying enemies. This reminds me a lot of some other game. Oh yes, Joust from Williams, the game where you fly around on ostriches jousting. Very popular arcade game in the early 1980s. The basic concept, controls, and even general screen layout are all taken directly from Joust, and given sort of a cutesy Nintendo-esque makeover. You need to repeatedly press the button to flap your arms to achieve some height. To pop an enemy's balloon, you need to hit him from a slightly higher position than he is. Then as he falls, either hit him again in midair, or after he's on the ground. A midair hit will net you more points. If you wait too long before hitting him the second time, he'll actually have enough time to reinflate his balloon. Now some additional features have been added, such as clouds that'll shoot little deadly electrical sparks that'll travel around the screen. And maybe best of all, when someone falls in the water, a giant fish gobbles them up. It's refreshing to see such a horrifying death in a Nintendo game. Additionally, there's a bonus round where you try to collect as many balloons as possible. Now a few interesting things. The 2-player version allows both players on screen at once, much like in Clu Clu Land. And a historical tidbit, the game was also released in arcades on the Versus system. However, Nintendo programmed the Versus system themselves. It was noticed that the Famicom version had smoother player movement, so Iwata was asked how this was done. Iwata explained the technical trick, which Nintendo then utilized in later games like Super Mario Bros. Now, the final mode simply has you drifting around a maze of deadly obstacles collecting balloons, getting enough points to raise your rank. Most folks don't like the whole swim through narrow passages filled with deadly items section of video games, but if you dig this sort of thing, well, good for you, give this a try. Overall, it's a pretty fun game, courtesy of HAL and Nintendo. This is it, our last game of this episode. Ice Climber, the second of two games released in January 1985. Already the Famicom is a year and a half old. This was once again a US launch title and a game that a lot of people fondly remember. It's better than Clu Clu Land, I guess. So the plot, a condor has stolen your vegetables, and you, Popo the Eskimo, need to climb a series of mountains and get the veggies back. Now, why would a bird be stealing eggplants? And seriously, is Popo farming eggplants up there at the North Pole? This game makes no sense. Well, armed with only a hammer, Poco must club his way through an army of dangerous seals. Wait a second, you say, you club seals in this game? Well, only in the Japanese version. In the US version, the seals were replaced by these mutant sheep, which are supposed to be midget yeti or something. Since the hunting of things like seals, whales, and dolphins is not really considered to be cool in this country. Right, so you jump with one button and swing the hammer with the other. One issue pops up very quickly, the jumping. Popo can jump up pretty high, but doesn't move much horizontally. You need to have like a bit of a running jump when moving from platform to platform. Even worse, the edges of the platform are impossible to land on. You will fall right through them. I don't know if this was like a programming glitch or an intentional decision, but it gets tiring real quick. When I see Popo falling right through a solid platform over and over, it really angries up the blood. The bonus part of each level is a chance to earn some extra points. Collect vegetables, make your way to the top of the mountain, and grab the condor. You will then get a winner bonus. Hooray! Please note this was developed by Nintendo Research and Development 2, headed by Gunpei Yokoi. These were the same guys who made Kid Icarus. I guess someone over there has some sort of thing for eggplants. Now each of the 32 levels gets progressively trickier, with the usual moving platforms, conveyor belts, and so on. Deadly drops of ice will form on the ceiling and kill you when they fall. Same idea was reused in Zelda 2. I think Ice Climber would be a lot more fun for me if it were easier to land a jump. Of course, it's really not fair to criticize any sort of pre-Super Mario platforming games for not having Super Mario-style controls. In 1984, I suppose this game controlled pretty well. One other thing, what about the polar bear? The cover art shows a polar bear in sunglasses and a red Speedo. In fact, the crazy cover art makes it look sort of like Santa Claus is going to whack a polar bear in the nuts with a wooden mallet. Now that's a good concept for a game, but in Ice Climber the bear appears only when you linger on one level for too long. Do that and he'll casually walk out and jump, and lower everything by one level. If you're on the bottom level when he does this, you die. This sort of puts an invisible time limit on each level. Well, despite its flaws, Ice Climber is a pretty good little game, so we're going to finish up episode 2 on a relatively positive note. Well, we've now reached the beginning of 1985, which will be a huge banner year for Nintendo. Consider this, 9 games were released in 1983, then 19 in 1984, and then in 1985 a huge jump to 68, all thanks to more publishers coming on board. Episode 3 will cover up to June 1985 and see 4 more publishers join the party, including 2 successful arcade manufacturers. Well, see you then.